would think that I could, if I wanted to, I could stop the sermon right here. And everything I said is true. When you get bad news, you have bad days, and you have questions for God that are not little life questions, but colossal ones, what should you do? You should trust God, wait on the Lord, which requires faith. All right, let's pray and let's be done. And everything I would have said in this sermon would be true, but I think you would and I would, and we would walk out of here and we would have more questions like, okay, yeah, but how do we do that? Just where do I go? Wegmans and pick up a bag of faith? Just where do we get that? I mean, that's easy to say, Pastor Brad, but how do we do it? Here's what I would say. I actually think there's a couple practical things that we learn very quickly, that we can learn from Habakkuk that he did. Here's a guy who's utterly confused, probably borderline a little angry, he's frustrated, confused about what God has even just said to him in the first 11 verses. He's confused about his theology. He feels like maybe even borderline God is contradicting himself and whether God is even fair or just or good. And here's the thing, I'll give him credit because I think he did a couple smart things that we begin to see even in verse 12 that I think we could do when we're in the midst of one of these situations so that we don't freak out, but we handle it in a way that is glorifying to God and good for us. Here's the first thing that I noticed, and I want you to write this down. What do? We do what Habakkuk did. In the midst of his question, in the midst of his anxiety, in the midst of his fear and his problem, what did he do? He stopped and thought. I know that seems ridiculously simple. So you're telling me, Brad, in the midst of a cancer diagnosis, a miscarriage, finding out that my spouse cheated on me, when I've given into sin again for the 10th time and I'm frustrated, I just got fired. I don't know how I'm going to pay my bills. You're telling me that the first thing I ought to do is run to the Lord, but what I should do is stop and think. That's absolutely what I'm telling you. I think that's what Habakkuk did here. And here's what I mean. Just think about what? I'm not just telling you to sit down and be like, hey, you just got diagnosed with cancer. I want you to think about cancer 24 hours a day. No, it's actually the opposite of that. I think the advice we see from Habakkuk is that you stop and you think not about your problem first, but you stop and think about God first. That is crucial, practical advice we get from Habakkuk. I mean, we see it right here in verse 12. What does he do? Even in the midst of his questions, look at what he's reminding himself about who God is. Look at verse 12. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God? Underline everlasting. There's something about God's qualities and his nature and his character. Are you not from everlasting, my Lord, my God, my Holy One? Holy, underline that. There's a second characteristic of God. I'm not even going to underline all the my's and how personal God is. We shall not die. Oh Lord, you have ordained, underline that word, something we learn about the character of God. You have ordained them as a judgment. Oh rock, underline rock. There's something we learn about God. Have established them for reproof. You who are of purer eyes than to see evil. Look at what Habakkuk begins to do here. He stops and he thinks. He didn't freak out first. He didn't focus on his problem first. He focused on God first. I love it. Martin Lloyd-Jones in these sermons on Habakkuk, he says what we need to do when we encounter one of these questions in these colossal moments in life, Martin Lloyd-Jones says we need to think back further. And here's what he means. He says when we get in one of those moments, our first tendency as human beings, we're freaking out, we got cancer, we want to look down the road. The Babylonians are coming, and we want to project ahead like 1 year or 1 week and be like, this is going to be terrible. I already know how this is going to end. They're going to murder us, chop our heads off, burn us at the city gates. The cancer's going to come. I'm not even going to be able to be a dad. I'm not going to see my daughter get past kindergarten. It's terrible. And we just freak out for no reason. We start looking down the road at things that may or may not even happen. And Martin Lloyd-Jones says, when you're in one of those moments, here's what you need to do. You need to come back. Come back to right now. Think back further. It's like walking on a sidewalk. You know, when you're walking on a sidewalk on a clear day and a spring day, we look down the sidewalk. Nobody usually walks on a spring day and looks down at their feet the whole time they walk. But when the pathway is icy and slippery, the worst thing you can do is to be looking down the road. You'll slip. When it's slippery and uncertain, what do? You look back a little further. You come down and you look here and you say, yeah, I'm just going to have to focus on the next step and make sure I don't step on that patch of ice. I'm going to put my foot on the solid ground for the next step. And let me be careful with the next step. I'm going to worry about all that stuff down the road. I'm going to have to just worry about the next step. So let me find the next solid ground spot so I don't slip. I think that's good advice for us. This is kind of what Habakkuk's doing here. Begins to what? Instead of focusing on his problem, he begins to remind himself of who God is, and he picks the firm ground to step on just by reminding himself of the character and the qualities and the promises of God. Look at verse 12. He says, "Are you not everlasting, O my God? We shall not die." It's incredible that he could say that coming off of verse 11. Look at verse 11. He's talking about the Babylonians. He says, "Then they sweep by like the wind and go on, guilty men, whose own might is their God." I mean, it's amazing. He would look at it and say, you know what? They got their God. They got their little g God. And you can read the rest of the verses leading up to chapter 3. It says, you know what? They think that these gods of metal and wood are going to somehow speak or listen or be God. What a joke. They're man-made. He says, but God, I remind myself of who you are. You're not man-made. You are eternal. When these Babylonians are gone and when I'm gone, you'll be here. This is not the end. Whatever comes down the road, you're the end of it. And he reminds himself of that. What does he say? You're the Holy One. He reminds himself, God, not only are you eternal, but you're holy. You're completely set apart. That's what holiness is. You draw a circle and put everything in all of creation in the midst of this circle. God's the only being that stands outside of that circle. He is completely separate and unique from all of creation. He is completely set apart and holy. And because he is separate, because he is unbelievably, eternally rare, he is of infinite, eternal worth. Meaning this, if God is infinitely holy, it means not only is he going to be here at the end of this, but he's not even capable of doing anything that's evil. So it's not going to be evil. He can't do it. Then he reminds himself this has all been ordained. So God not only is eternal and he can't do anything evil because that's not who he is. He's in control of all of this. And not only that, he's my rock. What does that tell me? He's going to be faithful to me. Not only is he eternal and he can't do evil, he controlled this, and he's going to be faithful to me, which means it's going to be good for me too. That's good stuff for any problem we're going through. That's good for Habakkuk. I tell people it's like a peanut butter jelly sandwich. Peanut butter jelly sandwich is just delicious. If you don't like a peanut butter jelly sandwich, there's something wrong with you. I'm just saying. It's delicious if you're 6. It's delicious if you're 96. All of the ingredients are good. Bread, good. The cheap bread too, like Wonder Bread, delicious. Jelly, just by itself, delicious. Strawberry jelly, Mayhaw jelly, good. You could put it in a cup, just Peanut butter by itself, good. I just eat peanut butter. But you put all those things together, oh man, way better. Way better. Here's what I love is that you see he stops, he thinks, reminds himself of who God is, and then look at what he did. Then he applies who God is to his problem. Now that helps us. God, I got a problem with these Chaldeans. I can either try to freak out and handle this myself, like everybody, let's get some swords, let's get some knives, we're going to go fight these people. No, God says, look, I want to remind you who I am. I'm going to be here when they're gone. Write this down and bank on it. It may not happen in your timetable, but I'm not evil. I'm good. I'm sovereign. It's going according to plan, and everything's going to work together for good because I'm a rock and I'm faithful. Now, put that together and apply it to this situation. If you do that, Habakkuk would be like, oh, okay. I mean, this is concerning, but knowing this is not freak out worthy. It's amazing. Stop and think. Don't self-diagnose. I mean, we do this all the time. It'd be like you having an illness. You get sick or you have a pulled muscle, and instead of calling the doctor, you just decide, you know what, I'm going to self-diagnose this. I think I need to take this medicine. Hey, let me go to the pharmacy and see if I can just get some medicine to address this problem because I think I know what the problem is. Hey, I feel like I got this muscle in my leg that's hurt. You know what I think is going to be the diagnosis? I think I can just solve this by going and running 2 miles or doing 100 jumping jacks. I don't know what my problem is. If I leap into action before calling the doctor, man, I make things worse. Take some medicine, I'm thinking that's not even at all what I needed for my body. Jumping jacks, I'm making this tear or whatever's in my leg worse. We do this all the time. Somebody diagnoses you with stage 3 cancer, and instead of running to God, you do what Brad Kirby did, which was the worst thing ever. Instead of running to God, I ran to Google. Before I got on my knees, this is a shame. Before I went home, before I prayed, before I went to the Lord and His Word, I ran home freaking out because they told me stage 3 B-cell lymphoma, and I started Googling. And you know what it did? It freaked me out. With stuff that 80% of it didn't apply to me, wasn't true, and never happened in my life. In the midst of our issue or thing, here's the first piece of advice for us. We stop and think, not about our problem, but about God first. And then here's the second thing, unbelievably hard. Easy to say, hard to do. Once we go to the Lord and we run to Him first, we ask Him our questions. Here's the second thing. We wait on God. I mean, look at verse 1 of chapter 2. It's fascinating. Habakkuk pours out his heart, and then he says, here's now what I'm going to do. I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what He will say. So how's he waiting on God? I think this is important. He's waiting on God and expecting God to speak. I think that's fine. We ought to do that. We ought to wait on God, but expect that He's going to answer. I'm waiting on to see what He will say and what I will answer concerning my complaint. I love that he says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to wait, and I'm going to wait in a watchtower. In 2,500 years ago, he would have been referring to one of two kinds of towers. There were watchtowers that they would have put in the midst of grain fields or vineyards that would allow somebody to get away from the hustle and bustle of all the harvesting and get up in a place where they were separate from all of the hustle and bustle so they could see and take a good picture of what was happening with the harvest, if it was all going right. Or probably what Habakkuk was referring to, because they were about to be attacked by the Chaldeans. There were these more traditional towers that the same thing. They were tall towers in your property, on the edge of your property, or on the walls of your city that would have allowed you to look out, get away from the hustle and bustle, get away from the ground level stuff so you can see a different picture. Separate yourself from it so you can see what's coming. See the landscape of what's happening. Look at what he says here. He says, in the midst of whatever's going on here, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring it to the Lord. I'm going to trust Him. I'm going to wait on Him. I'm going to put my faith in Him. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to kind of separate myself from the mess of what's going on here. And here's what I want to tell you to do. What does that mean? Am I telling you to try to forget about it and to walk away from it? No. Somebody gives you a diagnosis that's cancer. Am I telling you to go home, bring it to the Lord, and then pretend like the cancer doesn't exist? No, that's bad advice. Here's what I am telling you to do. I'm telling you at the point you bring it to the Lord, you focus on Him first instead of your problem, then here's what you do. You leave those problems at His feet. Leave them separate. Don't try to bring it to the Lord and then just try to go and then say, God, I want you to answer my question, but while I'm waiting, I'm going to go over here and start trying to do things. I'm going to get ahead of you. You leave it at His feet. Wait for the Lord, and here's what He tells us to do. How do we wait? We wait with an expectancy that He's going to speak. And here's the last thing I want to do. I actually think that people might have a question here. Well, how do we do that? How do you expect God to speak? How do we wait and do that? Here's what I would say. I'm actually going to let you answer this question just to see if I've had any kind of effectiveness over the last 4.5, 5 years. You ought to be able to answer this question. How is it that we hear God speak? Somebody tell me. What's that? His Word. Thank God you answered that way. Yes. I might have done a million things wrong here, but I did something right. How do you wait and hear the God of the universe speak? Let me tell you something. You have His words literally written down for you. Heard somebody much smarter than me say, you ever want to hear God speak out loud? Get the Bible, read it out loud. I mean, Psalm 119 says that the Word is a lamp unto our feet, a light unto our path. You're walking around stumbling in the dark. You want a flashlight to show you where to go. Here it is. As you're waiting, live in the Word. Live in it. He'll speak. He'll show you. And while you wait, Romans 10:17 says that He'll grow your faith. Faith comes by hearing, hearing by the word of Christ. He'll grow you so you can do the trusting and the waiting. So many times I've